Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hey everyone, I'm Anthony Cow, your host for this episode on the New Books Network. Today I'll be chatting with Chris Horton. Chris is one of the leading foreign journalists focused on Taiwan. He's been based in Taipei since 2015 and has contributed to the New York Times, Bloomberg, The Atlantic, and more. Whether it's profiles of democracy activists, features on laundry shop owners who've become Instagram stars, or deep dives into stinky tofu, Chris has covered all different dimensions of Taiwanese life. Now, Chris has taken all of that knowledge about Taiwan and distilled it into a new book, which comes out July 17th but is available for pre-orders today. It's called Ghost Nation, the story of Taiwan and its struggle for survival. Ghost Nation uses modern contexts and people as entry points on a walk through Taiwan's social and political history. It goes from Taiwan's indigenous traditions to interactions with various empires, the KMT takeover, the Taiwan economic miracle, and of course, comes to the present day with geopolitical tensions and semiconductors very front of mind. Anyways, we will let Chris take us through the details. Chris, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hi, Anthony. Thanks for having me on.
Well, Chris, let's start with an introduction. How did you end up in Taiwan, and how did Taiwan end up becoming your main beat for the last 10 or so years?
Well, it was not really a plan that I had at any point. It just kind of happened. I started off, my interest in East Asia started with China, and in the late 90s at the University of Kansas, I was studying journalism. And I saw that most of my I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I was looking towards the Spanish speaking world, and I realized most of my classmates, they were all speaking or studying Spanish, and I thought, well, like maybe I could do something to differentiate myself, look somewhere else. And a friend of mine was studying Chinese at the time, and he convinced me to enroll in Mandarin classes. And as soon as I started studying Chinese, I was hooked. It was just so different from what I had been exposed to studying Spanish. And I ended up getting a scholarship to study in central China in 2000, after having gone there a couple times, once for personal travel and another time for an intensive language class course. And I found myself very much hooked on the China story, the rise of China and everything that was happening there. And I ended up there for 13 years. And during that time, I didn't go to Taiwan at all. I didn't come to Taiwan. I found myself not really interested in Taiwan at that time, because it just felt like everyone's attention was focused on China. And that also includes so many of the Taiwanese people that I met in China at that time. But around 2008, things started to change. The positivity and optimism of China started to dissipate a bit, and the mood started to shift a bit. And by about 2012, I was ready to leave, and I went to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, I found myself, kind of questioning the direction that China was headed. And I was there for the umbrella protests, but just a few months before that, I had seen the sunflower protests in Taiwan. And at that point, I'd still never been to Taiwan, had never really considered, I had never taken much interest in it. Primarily because I just didn't know anything about it. And so when I saw the bravery of the sunflower protesters in the Legislative Yuan, but also outside of the Legislative Yuan, where you had student protesters getting blasted by water cannon, being beaten by police, and standing their ground, I felt like I wanted to know more about Taiwan. It seemed wrong of me to have kind of overlooked it or not taken interest, especially when it was so close to where I'd been living for years. And with the the ending or the wrapping up of the umbrella movement in Hong Kong with zero concessions by the Hong Kong government, um, I I kind of felt like I need to check out Taiwan, and I came over, and within an hour of being in Taipei, I was like, okay, I have to move here. It was just it was this amazing place that I had completely overlooked for years, and it was having a special moment. It was post sunflower, but it was also late Ma, and at that time there was a very strong energy in the sense of kind of standing up for Taiwan, and there were a lot of Chinese tourists here, and a lot of the individual Chinese tourists were very well behaved and really curious about Taiwan and coming here to learn about it, and have a good time as well. But the group tours were not very. They were a bit of a different story, and I spent most of my time in China in Yunnan province, where there were also lots of Chinese group tours, and I don't think it's a unique thing to China. Just group tours in general, people don't like group tours, and there were lots of Chinese group tours here in Taiwan. Places like Sun Moon Lake and Kunding were kind of overrun with Chinese tourists, and there was this sense of we want we want to change. We don't want Zhou's Taiwan anymore. And Tsai Ing-wen was running for president, and when I moved over in 2015, and Tsai was already campaigning for president, and I didn't know anything about Taiwan at the time, and every time I thought I knew something, I learned very quickly that my perhaps reasonable assumptions were nonetheless incorrect. And the more I learned about Taiwan, the more I realized that it was a fascinating place full of amazing stories, and I was kind of shocked at how the world in general was just oblivious to so much of just basic Taiwanese history, and that included myself. And so I guess I kind of began my Taiwan education then in 2015, and it was really eye-opening. And one thing that really helped with it is Taiwanese people themselves. Everybody, in China, talking about politics and history, it was kind of hit or miss. Some people really weren't interested in it, and also didn't know much about it, while others who might know more about it, they might be willing to talk, but you'd really have to kind of get to know them first. But in Taiwan, I just felt like everybody had an opinion and wanted to share their thoughts on Taiwan's history and its direction with you. And I just found it a very very accessible place full of people who were very willing to talk.
Well, glad that you made the hop across to Taiwan straight. And I do recall back in 2015, you were probably one of the few journalists who wrote about Taiwan for mainstream US publications on any sort of regular basis. As you said, a lot of folks in the Anglophone world probably didn't have a lot of basic knowledge about Taiwan. And there was this period between, I don't know, 2015, 2020, where almost all of the New York Times articles about Taiwan were maybe by you. But now, there's a lot more people, and there are more Western journalists.
Which it's good that it's not just me, and it wasn't just me, but it is. This is a positive development for Taiwan and the world's understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, I am curious what you think, about this evolution over the past 10 years in the journalistic landscape, and have you seen your personal role also evolve as you've become one among many of these journalists?
Oh, for sure. I mean, in the beginning, I when I came over, there were a few. So Bloomberg and Reuters had the biggest presences here, and they still do. But basically, none of the big three U.S. papers, the Times, the Post, and the Journal, none of them had full-time staff here. there were a handful of other journalists here, but yeah, it was really quite a small scene. And I think, if you compare it to where we are today, where you've got more than 100 correspondent members of the Foreign Correspondents Club, that's a really big shift over 10 years. But yeah, I think in 2015, you basically, by that time, everybody who had people in all the different publications who had people in Taiwan, most of them had moved on, most likely to China. And it was a difficult time as a freelancer to pitch stories to editors about Taiwan, because nobody really cared. It was China was still the center of attention in East Asia, and nobody really knew much about Taiwan or its story. And so, yeah, in the beginning, I had to find kind of quirky pieces. The China threat story. Excuse me. Might want to edit that. Sorry. The China threat story was definitely there, but it wasn't. The threat wasn't as great as it is now. I mean, they were still building up their military, and Xi Jinping was still focused on consolidating power. So even the China story, talking about Taiwan from a China angle, even that there were limits to how much appetite there was for that story amongst editors for foreign media. The things like, I mean, you mentioned stinky tofu. That was kind of a quirky Taiwan story that I was able to sell to the New York Times, and actually that got quite a bit of traction. And I learned a lot from the public reaction to that story, because it really showed how divided Taiwanese media and Taiwanese society was in different ways, because and as well as highlighting how kind of ignored Taiwanese people felt at the time by the rest of the world. So that was, I think, I want to say late 2015, early 2016, but basically, once the story came out, it got a lot of coverage in local Taiwanese media, and you had kind of blue or Kuomintang leaning media, kind of pro-China media, kind of accusing me of saying that Taiwan had invented stinky tofu, which my article, by the way, did not say that. I said it came over from China. But just like how pizza went across the Atlantic Ocean from Italy to the United States and changed in the process, the way that Taiwanese do stinky tofu is different from how it's done in China. And I noted that as well. And so there was, in the more pro-Taiwan, Taiwanese centric green media, you had a lot of people kind of, it was more like, yeah, our Taiwanese stinky tofu is having a moment. And there were kind of like vox pop street interviews on by television stations here, and you could really see, older people were like, oh yeah, no, stinky tofu is Chinese, and young people would be like, I think you could call it Taiwanese. And so that was a kind of a learning moment for me as well. I definitely got a firsthand view of the different kind of fault lines in Taiwanese society. But yeah, the election of Tsai Ing-wen was definitely a kind of a turning point. But I think the main turning point was when Tsai called President-elect Trump after he won his first term, his first election. So that was when the New York Times ran two stories on that the first day. One was based in D.C., the other was based in Beijing. And some editor, I don't know who, was at some point was like, it is the Taiwanese president who called Trump. Maybe we should get Taiwanese reaction. And I was the only. I had written a few stories for the Times while I was in Hong Kong, and they were looking for someone that they knew in Taiwan, and I was basically the only person they knew, and so they contacted me. I was, of course, very excited to write the story, and having after the Stinky Tofu story, I felt like Taiwan was this pretty divided society. But what I found with this news piece, this reaction to the call, was a very united Taiwan. And I interviewed people from both sides of the political spectrum, young and old, male and female, and everybody said the same thing. None of them trusted Trump, but they were all very happy that Taiwan's existence had been acknowledged by the president-elect of the United States, because they'd felt, as Taiwanese, and very understandably, that they had been ignored for too long. They'd made the transition out of martial law, 4 miserable decades of martial law, and had become one of the freest and most democratic countries in East Asia and even the world. And, still they were being ignored. So I think, regardless of who it was that was taking the phone call from Tsai, just the fact that they took the call and kind of like told the world, yeah, the president of Taiwan called me. Why shouldn't I talk to Taiwan? That was a really powerful moment, I think, for a lot of Taiwanese people.
Yeah, that was certainly a quite memorable moment. Seems it's hard to believe that was almost 10 years ago now. A lot has certainly changed and evolved. I guess
Indeed.
Probably still no editors from these publications in Taiwan, but we'll see if that changes.
That's true. So now you have a very large foreign press corps in Taiwan, and in the beginning, I would kind of host, if people were moving over or if they were passing through town. I would organize small, like, rochao dinners, and just kind of, it was kind of like a welcome wagon type situation, where I'd invite others, scholars, fellow journalists, anybody else who might be helpful in kind of helping the newly arrived settle in. But after a while, the number of journalists that came over, it was increasing to the point where a table at a rochao couldn't actually hold all the people. And so I got involved in the Foreign Correspondence Club, the Taiwan Foreign Correspondence Club, which is now probably one of the most important clubs, foreign correspondent clubs in all of Asia. And that's for 2 reasons. One is the crackdown on press freedom that's kind of happening around Asia, but also it's because of the club kind of going from being like a happy hour, a drinking club, to something much more focused and serious now. And it's been a very good development for coverage of Taiwan, in not just in English but in other languages as well. But you do make a very good point. There's not really any editors here, so it doesn't matter how good your reporters are on the ground if the editors who are handling the stories and kind of shaping coverage, if they don't really understand Taiwan. And I'm not saying editors don't understand Taiwan, but you do get a better level of coverage if editors are living in the place that's being written about. And I think a good example of that is the coverage of in 2014, the umbrella protests in Hong Kong versus the sunflower protests in Taiwan. In Hong Kong, you had dozens, if not hundreds, of editors based there, and they would, in between, on their way to and from work every day, they would walk by the protest sites, and they lived in the city that was being written about whenever there was coverage of the protests. And Taiwan, even though it's not that far from Hong Kong, it's not it doesn't share a land border or anything like that. It feels a world away. And yeah, so you had amazing coverage of the umbrella movement, but Sunflower didn't get quite the same coverage. And I think things have definitely gotten better since then. In the 11 years since those protests. But yeah, I think getting some editors, whatever publications end up with moving their editors over here, they'll end up most likely with some of the best coverage of Taiwan. And it's not going away as a story.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense, and maybe there will be an editor hosting those 热炒 dinners, which I guess for listeners, maybe not all our listeners know what 热炒 is, but I guess it's I don't know, communal eating with often with Taiwan beer and fried dishes and such. I think you actually in the credits and the thanks section of your book is there is a restaurant that you mentioned that is near the Dawn Forest Park. Is that the place that you would host people?
Yes, Eight Immortals Grill. The Chinese name is Ba Xian Tan Kao. It's kind of a legendary rooftop Ruchao restaurant. Yeah, and Ruchao, it's a cheap and cheerful Taiwanese style, stir fry and seafood kind of restaurant. And one of my I interviewed one of the owners of 886, a Taiwanese restaurant in New York, and Eric Zay, I believe, and he said I wrote a story a while ago about Ruchao's for Nikkei Asia, and Eric, I liked how Eric put it. It's a place where you've got millionaires and construction workers dining next to each other. And that's one thing I really enjoy about Taiwanese society. There's in terms of like the economic strata, they exist. There are people with lots of money and people with less, but they're not so separated from each other, and they, socially, people don't kind of separate themselves too much according to class. And I really enjoyed that after coming over from China and Hong Kong, where I think there's that class, those class divisions felt a lot more rigid and kind of enforced. But yeah, it's I mean, Robert Tsao, the billionaire founder of United Microelectronics, he stops by that restaurant from time to time. It's just it's a very, Ruchao is a very Taiwanese experience, and anybody who visits Taiwan, I highly encourage them to stop by a Ruchao.
Yeah, I guess in the show notes, I will dig up your articles and link them, as well as find a link to the restaurant for anybody who is curious to check it out when they're in Taipei next. Well,
fantastic.
Besides food, we can probably get to the book now, so that
sure.
We have enough time to dive in. So, diving into the book, in your first chapter, you begin by discussing Tsai Ing-wen's 2016 apology to indigenous Taiwanese. Tell us more about why that was a particularly salient moment, and also why you chose to start off the book with this indigenous grounding.
Okay, I'll answer your questions in reverse order. I wanted to start and finish the book with indigenous Taiwanese because they're the original inhabitants of Taiwan, and they're living proof that Taiwan has, despite claims made by the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan has not always been Chinese, and I would argue it's not even Chinese today. There are, of course, strong connections to China, but there's strong connections to Japan as well, and other places. Mandarin wasn't really spoken here until 1945, or after 1945. But yeah, in terms of telling Taiwan's story, I thought, you have to start with indigenous people, and rather than start with the arrival of the Dutch, because there's not much of a written historical record of Taiwan prior to that. and the Dutch arrived. I guess that would be 401 years ago in 1624. It just I didn't want to write a history book. I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist, and I'll leave the history books to the experts, to the pros. But I thought something set in a more recent time frame, but connected to Taiwan's indigenous history would probably be a little more accessible for a non-academic reader. And so I kind of looked around, but I mean, it really kind of just sold itself. I mean, it's a great, the the apology to indigenous Taiwanese by Tsai Ing-wen. It really brings together a lot of different elements of Taiwan's history all in one place. And as a writer, kind of allowed me to foreshadow some of the things that are going to be discussed later in the book. But you have the Taiwanese president who's actually who's acting as the president of the Republic of China government, which is Taiwan's government, a colonial government that came over in the 1940s from China. It's in a building, the presidential office building that was built by the Japanese Empire when they controlled Taiwan, and you have the ROC president apologizing to indigenous Taiwanese, and in the ceremonies to welcome ancestral gods of indigenous Taiwanese, but also the Christian God. You get a sense of the diversity of indigenous Taiwanese people. So the Chinese Communist Party calls indigenous Taiwanese, what is it? Taiwan Gaoshanzu. Yeah. So the Taiwan mountain minority or mountain ethnic group, but there's more than one group. They're very diverse. They're all Austronesian speaking. Their languages are all Austronesian, but not, I mean, quite different. And they have different traditions, customs, beliefs, clothing, and religious rituals. And so you see some of these rituals at the beginning of the book in the apology scene, but you also have one of the legacies of colonialism is the strong presence of Christianity in the amongst the indigenous Taiwanese. I believe roughly 80% of indigenous Taiwanese are Christian of some sort, and the two main varieties are Presbyterian and Catholic. And so you at one point during the introduction, during the apology, at that ceremony, you have maybe 8 or so ministers and priests in their traditional indigenous clothing, and they're praying to the Christian God in their own languages, all at the same time. And so there is this kind of like Babel like effect where it's quite interesting and powerful, I would say. But for someone who thinks that Taiwan's just about Confucius or something like that, I think this is also a good way to kind of highlight, like, look, that what you might think about Taiwan isn't necessarily the case. If all you know is what you've heard through either China or even like the KMT, the Kuomintang here, the Chinese Nationalist Party, who came over in the 40s. Both the Communist Party and the Kuomintang, they kind of assert that Taiwan is inherently Chinese. And it doesn't really take much digging below the surface to kind of realize that that's far from there's no doubt that there's Chinese elements to Taiwaneseness, but there's so much more as well. And I thought that particular scene was quite useful in kind of introducing the reader to the depth and diversity of Taiwanese society and like the identities contained within Taiwaneseness itself.
That is a rather appropriate choice if you are trying to frame Taiwan within the context of settler colonialism, as well as its relationship with different empires, and also start picking at that trope of Taiwan has been a part of China since time immemorial,
Right.
reunification, etc. I'm curious on this note about Taiwan being a part of China, time immemorial, so on and so forth. Can you tell us how, and I think you touch upon this, in the following chapters of the book, why it's not just Chinese media, but maybe also sometimes Western media that maybe inadvertently perpetuates this trope, and how can listeners more critically think about the situation?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of Western media, it, Asia is, it's not its core strength. It's far away from the corporate headquarters or wherever most of the top editors are based, whether they're in DC or New York or London or continental Europe. So it's understandable that Western media coverage of Asia in general might not be as good as stuff kind of closer to home. But that said, Asia is important, and if you're going to cover a story, it's important to get it right. When it comes to coverage of Taiwan, I think so. I do cite a lot of different New York Times coverage of Taiwan, going back to the mid 19th century in the book, and initially it's I think the first mention of Taiwan in the Times is the Times calls Taiwan Formosa, and at that point it's partially and very loosely ruled by the Manchu Qing dynasty that also was administering China at the time, and there was a I wouldn't call it a conflict. It was very short lived, but basically an American ship, an American merchant ship, the Rover had crashed off of the coast of Pingdong in southern Taiwan, and I think the Paiwan people who encountered the shipwreck survivors assumed that they were Dutch and killed them all, and basically you ended up with months later a punitive expedition was sent by the U.S. from Amoy, now known as Xiamen in Fujian province, and the U.S. They went in to that area where the shipwreck occurred, and they were going to get revenge on the native Paiwan people who had killed the shipwrecked survivors, and basically they without giving too much away, they end up getting more than they bargained for, and the first military encounter between the U.S. and Taiwan was between the U.S. military and indigenous Taiwanese people, and the U.S. loses. So it's that right there. I find that story interesting because it's a little counterintuitive, but yeah, over the years, later on, when Taiwan is a Japanese colony, it's Japanese Formosa. The Times kind of writes about how writes in rather glowing terms of the civilization project that the Japanese, that Imperial Japan had undertaken there, and all the benefits that colonialism had brought to Taiwanese society. And then later on, you have during the Cold War, you have the KMT running the show in Taiwan, and back then the U.S. didn't recognize the People's Republic of China with its capital in Beijing as the true government of China. They recognized the ROC with its capital in Taipei as the true government of China, and the United States would refer to it as Free China, and so there was coverage of Taiwan at that time was very much through these are our our Cold War allies. This is free China, and not only are the communists bad, but also anybody seeking Taiwanese independence or Taiwanese self-determination, they're kind of viewed as troublemakers. And I think, even though the Cold War is over, or at least that Cold War is over, and martial law is ended, but I think, you still have a lot of people who grew up, some of the older editors right now, they very much grew up in that kind of Cold War era. And I think, it takes, I think, you need people, when people who are reporters now are editors, in high places later, I think that'll definitely help shift the international coverage of Taiwan. But yeah, I think old tropes die hard. I mean, I do think there has been some progress. You really don't see terms like renegade province or breakaway province too much anymore. But you do see stuff like, Taiwan and China split in 1949, and that's an inaccurate oversimplification of things. I mean, it was really the Chinese Civil War spilled into Taiwan after Japan surrendered at the end of to end the Second World War. And maybe that's just too complicated, or I'm not sure what the issue is. But one of the things that I think has been a good development has been, it used to just be like Taiwan was only framed in terms of how Beijing viewed it, and so like Beijing views Taiwan as Chinese territory. That was in many reports. That was kind of the standard default boilerplate. And now I think you see a lot more. The Communist Party of China considers Taiwan to be Chinese territory, despite having never ruled it. So like the Chinese claim, it's clearly important and relevant to coverage of Taiwan, especially in a cross-strait context. But you also have to include the fact that the communists have never controlled Taiwan. This is an attempt to expand the PRC, and without that framing, you might have a situation where people think, oh, maybe Taiwan's kind of like a semi-autonomous entity that's part of China, like Hong Kong. And I mean, I know there are people, smart people, informed people who maybe just aren't that familiar with this region, who kind of assume that Taiwan's status is similar to Hong Kong's, and they're trying to break away or something like that. And if editors don't make sure that kind of both sides of the coin are covered, yes, China claims Taiwan, but it's never ruled it. Then I think you create the environment for more people to continue making those mistakes.
Yeah, well, so we went from indigenous folks being on Taiwan, Dutch colonization, American adventures in the, I guess, Opium War and after era, through the White Terror martial law period, where free China was not so free, and now we're discussing how Taiwan is framed within the context of China oftentimes, although the situation might be improving. At the same time, I find it rather amusing how, I think this is probably near the end of chapter 8, where you are talking about Ma Ying-jeou, and the way that you describe his administration is he's trying to make Taiwan China again, which I feel is kind of fitting and maybe adds to the confusion that we were just talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, Ma was just yesterday, he was in Xiamen meeting with Wang Huning, who's in charge of Taiwan policy for Xi Jinping, and he was reaffirming the so-called 1992 consensus, where it's basically kind of code, or like cross-strait diplo speak for Taiwan is China. And Ma, while he's no longer president, he does have symbolic power, having been the only democratically elected KMT president this century. Li Denghui, the first KMT president to be democratically elected, he kind of has an asterisk next to his name because he was born in Taiwan, and his Taiwanese colors really kind of came out when after he was elected. But Ma Ying-jeou is very much ideologically, focused on pushing the narrative that Taiwan is inherently Chinese, and he's he frequently goes to China to amplify that message. And so yeah, if you're an editor in DC or New York and you're looking at that, you're kind of like, all right, so there's some credence to this, I guess. I mean, like, why would this former president be going over there if you didn't have a significant number of people in Taiwan who felt that they were, that they should be part of China? And while there are a lot of people in Taiwan who have some degree of Chinese identity, I mean, there's plenty of people in the United States who are, hyphenated Americans. Like my mother's side of the family, they think of my generation, not so much, but my mom and aunts and uncles, they think of themselves as Italian Americans, right? And I mean, so why can't you be Chinese Taiwanese? But the thing is that they think of themselves as Taiwanese. There's Taiwaneseness in that identity, and there's, I mean, I think definitely fewer than 10%, maybe fewer than 5% of Taiwanese people think of themselves as exclusively Chinese. And in terms of the percentage of Taiwanese who want unification with the People's Republic of China, as soon as possible, I think that's been hovering around 2 to 3% for some time. The majority of Taiwanese people, the overwhelming majority of Taiwanese people, they want to maintain the status quo, and the status quo is Taiwan's an independent country, happens to be called the Republic of China, at least its government, and they're they have their democratic society that they worked so hard and sacrificed so much to build, and they want to keep it that way.
Well, in your last two chapters, you talk about how Taiwan lacks formal representation, given this weirdness about Republic of China versus Taiwan, and lack of UN recognition and all of that. But at the same time, it's still indispensable from this perspective of defense and semiconductor supply chains. Can you give us a little bit of the background about why Taiwan is simultaneously invisible yet important? And also, am I correct to assume that it has something to do with your choice to name the book, or maybe your editor's choice to name the book Ghost Nation?
Oh, well, originally I was going to call it Ghost Island, but then my editors kind of correctly pointed out, look, you're criticizing Western media, international media, for referring to Taiwan as an island rather than a country, and then you're going to call your book Ghost Island. And Ghost Island is a term that has it has some cachet in a Taiwanese context. It's been used for different meanings at different times in Taiwan's history, but I took that point, and so we decided to call it Ghost Nation, and it just calling it Ghost Nation in terms of the title itself, it makes clear that this, where this book is coming from. This is, while certain aspects of Taiwan's status are undetermined, it is very much a country, and it's just, all you have to do is come here and it becomes very apparent. You go through customs and immigration at the airport. You're spending locally minted currency. There's a military here that only serves Taiwan, and there's a democratically elected government that administers it. There's no, just the idea that Taiwan is somehow part of China. It just defies reality. It's not. This is not the opinion of a foreigner. This is just all you have to do is just see it with your own eyes, and I have a lot of Chinese friends that have come over here, and they kind of were pleasantly surprised, and most of them by the end of their visit, they're like, this place should not be China. It's fine the way it is, and that's reassuring to hear. I mean, I think it's kind of shows how important the propaganda by the CCP in Beijing, as well as propaganda here, by the KMT, how it's necessary, because you people aren't naturally going to be like, oh yeah, this place is China. You have to trick them. You have to say things that kind of go against reality and build a case. But any sort of it's mostly built on kind of like this blood and soil nationalism, Han ethno nationalism, and without that, people have to kind of have that perspective in order to really buy into the Taiwan is part of China fiction. But in terms of Taiwan's invisibility, yeah, I mean, it is invisible, but much less so than before. And I think a big turning point, touching upon the chips thing, 2020, you had this pandemic coming out of China that Taiwan handled, better than pretty much anywhere else on the planet, and without lockdowns. But during the early days of the pandemic, you had supply chains for automobiles and other goods were thrown into disarray, and that kind of created a situation where demand for chips for semiconductors shifted much more towards tablets and PCs and kind of personal devices, because people were working from home and all that, and demand for cars kind of dropped for some time. And then once demand bounced back, automobile manufacturers and other companies, other industries found that suddenly, like, their access to semiconductors wasn't there anymore, and they were all coming from from Taiwan, mostly from TSMC. And you have this situation where boardrooms and governments around the world suddenly woke up to the reality of Taiwan's huge importance when it comes to semiconductors, and when it comes to the most cutting edge semiconductors, which are almost exclusively produced by TSMC, a company that 10 years ago only people who were covering tech had ever heard of, but now it's a household name now. And it's the background story of Taiwan's semiconductor industry. That's quite interesting in itself. It, like anything here, it has political roots. I mean, Taiwan was it manufactured lots. It was a major plastic producer and kind of producer of cheap goods. I remember most of my plastic toys growing up as a kid said made in Taiwan. That was kind of my first introduction to Taiwan. But at that time, as things were liberalizing here, there was an awareness by the KMT that it was they, in order to stay in power, they were going to, and something similar kind of happened, I think, with China after the Cultural Revolution. If you want to stay in power, you have to deliver economic development, and you have to move up the value chain, and eventually, labor intensive, cheap goods, they were going to be produced somewhere else, and that's what's happened. But it's the high value exports like semiconductors that the KMT government in the 60s and 70s very astutely saw as kind of the future for Taiwan. And it's now that the world realizes that Taiwan's important to this important to the the global technology supply chain. It's changed how the world views Taiwan, and that near monopoly of the world's most cutting edge semiconductors has really given Taiwan a place at the table, even if it doesn't have a seat at the United Nations. I mean, after 2020, if you look at all the delegations that came to visit Taiwan, from all the major democracies around the world, they were all, chips were at the top of the discussion agenda. It was very clear that yes, this is our democratic partner who shares these ideals that we hold dear, but also it produces these chips that we hold dear. And yeah, so in terms of the technological supply chain, Taiwan's importance is now very, very well understood. But then in terms of another chain, the First Island chain, which kind of it's a chain of democratic countries that span from, even though it's a peninsular country, South Korea to Japan, and then Taiwan and the Philippines. All these countries, all these democratic countries, are they kind of just geographically, but also politically, they kind of contain China's expansionism. And the weakest link in the chain is Taiwan, because it's the only one that doesn't have a mutual defense treaty with the United States. And while the Communist Party of China likes to say they're just trying to reclaim Chinese territory, that's it's a nice story. What they really want is to break the First Island chain. And if Taiwan were to fall to the People's Republic of China, suddenly the People's Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, would be on the doorstep of both Japan and the Philippines. While you do have a lot of apologists for China saying, well, they're just trying to right the wrongs of history, and then they'll stop there. We saw that in Europe in the run up to the beginning of the Second World War. That's just not what happened. Once Germany got what it wanted in Austria, it looked elsewhere. And you have China and Russia both kind of seeking to expand their territory and working very closely together. And if democracies don't work with Taiwan and show some real solidarity, not just thoughts and prayers, but having hardware over here and drawing clear lines, then you're gonna see history repeat itself again.
Well, besides geopolitical sobering realities and I guess John Mearsheimer-esque realist takes, what do you hope people take away from Ghost Nation, and who do you hope reads the book?
I hope everybody reads it. I set what I feel like was a pretty high bar for myself, so I wanted it to be accessible and informative and interesting for people who knew nothing about Taiwan or even Asia. But I also wanted it to be something that would hopefully be interesting and have some kind of new angles or perspectives or interesting tidbits for people who are familiar with Taiwan. But I think in terms of takeaways, I think you have so much framing of Taiwan as being this kind of there's kind of a horse trading aspect to it, where it's like the U.S. and great powers decide Taiwan's future. But I think by reading this book, it becomes very apparent that Taiwanese people have agency, and they will they have fought hard over many generations for the sovereignty and democracy they have today, and they will fight to keep that, whether or not they have the United States or other democracies helping them out. I think that's something that the current president, Lai Ching-te, who's been in office a little bit more than a year now, I think that's been the main message that he's been kind of putting out there, both domestically and internationally. And I think in terms of other takeaways, Taiwan's future, it's going to be intertwined with the future of democracies around the world. And it's democracies also have some agency. Like I think a lot of Chinese propaganda is kind of like, look, there's nothing you can do. This is going to happen regardless of if you want it or not. So why get in the way of the tide of history, as Xi Jinping likes to say, kind of portraying the absorption of Taiwan into the PRC as inevitable. It does have that idea has traction with a lot of people, and it's like, why fight an unwinnable war? But I think, if you look at the combined power, the combined strength of democracies around the world, and Taiwan itself, and Taiwan's natural geographic advantages in terms of kind of holding off an invasion, then it's not as hopeless as Xi Jinping and the Mearsheimers and the Quincy Institutes want you to believe it is. Taiwan, the future is not written; it's not set in stone, and Taiwan is very much a sovereign, free nation, and it can remain so.
Well, with that call to action, I think it's a good point to start wrapping up our episode. So thank you very much, Chris, for coming on the New Books Network, and congratulations on the publication of Ghost Nation.
Thanks so much for having me on, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
And listeners, if you want to read Chris's book, you can pre-order today online, and it should ship upon the formal release on July 17th, 2025.